AI Game Changers podcast with Luke Wibbs.
Where do you think that we need to start this conversation so people would really understand you and your background?
Maybe going all the way back, kind of to my time at high school. When I finished high school, I was struggling a bit to figure out what exactly I wanted to do, and there was always this curiosity for business-related topic and at the same time for tech-related topics. And I was actually considering to study mechanical engineering. But then just before finishing high school, I talked to a couple of people that I was somehow fond of and that whose opinion kind of mattered to me, and then eventually decided that I want to do one thing right and not two things simultaneously, because in Germany we have those Wirtschaftsingenieur studies, so a combination of engineering and business related topics. I decided against it and said, okay, let's start with doing one thing right and study business. Of course, it's always the question what you really learn in business studies. In the end, people who haven't studied it, they manage to pick it up fairly fast. But still, I think the kind of mindset and some questions that you're kind of forced to think about during your studies, they're actually important in business studies. So I did that for 3 years in my undergrad. And then this curiosity for tech came back. And I was then looking for a program where I could do that at least to a certain extent. So that's when I decided then to move to Munich, to move to TUM, to the Technical University of Munich, because they still have a combined study program between business and I did mechanical engineering. Probably I should have done computer science in hindsight, but mechanical engineering was also fun. They had a combined program where you would basically do the master business part from the combined studies and the bachelor tech part. So on the tech side, I didn't learn too much, obviously. So I had to do all these drawings in mechanical engineering with a proper pen and paper, and it was a bit painful. But it was actually quite good, and I think what it shows kind of is this curiosity about tech topics. Plus, what I also did in Munich was that I attended CDTM, which I actually had never heard of before. So that during my research of study programs that came about, and CDTM, I guess you know it, but it's not that well known just yet. It's basically a study program in the field of technology management. It's a very small cohort, roughly 25 students per semester. Very innovation driven, by now very entrepreneurial driven, and that was just for me a super cool environment, because we were working in very interdisciplinary teams. On one of my first projects there, we were 5 people. Of those, I was the only business guy. We had 2 computer scientists, 1 chemical engineer, and 1 mechanical engineer, and that was just lots of fun working with those people on real problems. So I think that's kind of what I did in 5.5 years of studies, and then I tried to continue with that spirit, kind of, because I liked working at that intersection.
Yeah, do you know the CDTM? I think it's pretty well known now, and obviously, I think with companies like Personio in the highlight reel, they seem to put out. They're like an entrepreneurial melting pot, right? Like, if you look at most of the German, especially in southern Germany, you look at most of the startups, most people have either touched on some kind of program with CDTM at some stage. I've said that sentence multiple times in this podcast, so I think I'm probably going to have to start charging royalties. But it's an awesome organisation, right? And it seems like they give people the right blend of entrepreneurial, not the mindset, because I think you either have that or you don't, but they give people the right tools to go off and create something.
I think it's about the tools, about the people that you connect with, and I think to a certain extent, can you learn entrepreneurship? I don't exactly know, but I think they help you reflect about the right kind of questions, and you kind of learn the approach. I think it's actually a bit similar to business studies in a sense, because as I said, I think the hard skills of business studies, it's not about being the best accountant or so, but it's about understanding how fundamentally business works and how the different bits and pieces belong together. And I think that's what CDTM is very good at when it comes to those rather innovation-driven topics. And I deliberately use the term innovation and not entrepreneurship, because actually there's to a certain extent a big I'm not sure if it's a big discussion, but that's a discussion that I have with people from CDTM today, whether it should be an entrepreneurship or innovation program. And I would actually like it not to be an entrepreneurship program, because I think with that one we would be a bit narrow-minded, and I'm an entrepreneur now, so obviously I like the concept of it, but I think there are so many so many different avenues that you can take to actually have an impact. And it's more about this innovation mindset and trying to challenge things and try to do things new. But you not always have to do it as an entrepreneur in the sense of I have my own business and I do something from there. You can also do that in politics. You can be an intrapreneur that does that in a large corporate. You can do it in academia, all kinds of things. So that's one thing that is important to me, kind of, and that I hope that CDTM continues to do. That they are not becoming basically an incubator on steroids, or however you want to call it, but that it's actually and they're super successful. And if you look at the track record, it's crazy how many successful companies came out of this. But I think that's a bit the downside of the time kind of that we're living in, if you want to call it the downside, that there's so much attention on entrepreneurs that those founders, they just get lots of prominence, despite the fact that there are other people in the CDTM community who have achieved great things who are maybe not featured as prominently, despite the fact that they're also kicking ass, kind of.
Well, yeah. So why do you think that is?
Why entrepreneurship is so popular? It's a good one. I think it's just
interesting to you.
Why it's interesting to me. I think those are two different questions. So I think the first part, why it's so popular, or why the perception of this is so prominent, kind of. I think in the end, especially in the bubble that we're in, right? I think that's just something that by now is part of that job that you talk about it. And if you do fundraising, you kind of have to build a brand for the company, because otherwise it will just be difficult to actually be successful. So you have to make sure that you're somehow known. And I think for some other fields, that is maybe a bit different, or the bubbles are just very different. So if we take academia, I think in academia you can also be super famous, but most of the time the academia fame and the entrepreneurship fame, they don't have too much of an overlap in terms of audiences that they interact with. So I think that might be a bit of a bias that we have, whom we perceive as being well known and whom we don't. And if I talk to people who are not from Munich and not from my bubble, and I tell them about CDTM, they don't know it. And actually, when you talk to some students at TUM, not all of them know it. So I think it's a bit of a bias in our bubble, kind of. And the second question was what I like about entrepreneurship, right? Or I rephrased the question to this. For me, it's really this. I think, as I mentioned earlier, this kind of ability that you can start to a certain extent from scratch. And that goes in the same direction as the innovation part that I just spoke about, that you can start from scratch, that you can challenge things, and that you can do things, or that you can try to do things right from the very first day, and try to find your own niche of having impact, and that you have lots of freedom in doing that. I think that's the part that is somehow appealing to me the most.
So where do you think that comes from? Because surely it would just be an easier life to go and just work for a huge multinational company and just earn a salary and just get your pension and eventually retire one day, right? So where do you think the energy and the passion for entrepreneurship and what you're doing right now, where do you think that comes from?
Well, that's a good one. I've worked in bigger organizations. And I think what I do now is just more fun. So very opportunistically speaking, if it's about how much do I enjoy my day-to-day work, I enjoy it more now because of that freedom, because of that aspect. And the freedom, that always sounds a bit esoteric or so, but I truly believe that the freedom, in a sense, let me maybe rephrase it, because I think it's not necessarily freedom, but it's like the how immediate you have an impact and how immediate things can change. And it's not that you're the small gear in a big organization and, the small gear might in the end move something, but it just takes a lot of time, and that you're part of a big machine. So it's very hard to understand what your eventual impact is. And, now if I take the gear of the same size into an organization that is just much smaller, then I suddenly see that I'm actually moving something with that. And I think that's the aspect that motivates me. And, obviously as a founder, there's also this kind of bet that you're having that at some point it will also pay off financially. But I think this is This is not necessarily the thing that drives me the most, because this is, I think, in the end, not something that you can rely on. If it works, then it's great, but the chances of not working are also fairly high. So if you want to go for financial safety and stability, I probably should have stayed where I was before. Probably that would have been the safer aspect. But this fun part and this immediance, is immediance an English term? Immediance of impact. I think that's the kind of aspect that appeals most to me.
Yeah, man. Do you know what? I know this is a very small comparison, but so I used to work with a lot of big, huge companies, and used to think it was all about the big logos, like just purely from a recruitment standpoint. And I always think now you could hire 100 people. I know, again, this is a bit of a far-fetched example, but I could hire 100 people into those organizations and they wouldn't even notice. But working with startups and early stage organizations, you hire 1 or 2 people and they have massive impact. Because they make up such a huge percentage of the business, right? Yes. So I understand your philosophy and your narrative about impact, because you can get lost in the sea of just a huge logo with thousands and thousands of people, whereas the spotlight is on you a little bit when you work in an early stage company, right? Because not just the responsibility and the expectations of someone like yourself in these early stage roles is massive. Like, you must be doing a ton of different things constantly on a day-to-day, right? And your scope of work must cross like 100 different touch points every single day, right? So, I get where you're coming from, man.
Yeah.
So do you feel... Go ahead.
No, I just want to second that, because I think that's probably the biggest change, the scope of work that you have, especially in the role that I have with Entrix. Still, what I also want to make sure is that we don't over romanticize the kind of startup life, in the sense of that's the only way where you can have an impact. I think it's just about this kind of perspective that you take, because the big organizations, they are big for a reason, and they actually really leave a mark. And I was working with energy companies beforehand, and they literally keep our society running. And where we are standing today with Entrix, for society doesn't really matter just yet. But if you work for the large energy companies these days, they are just so mission critical for us as a society to function and to work. So it is very important that people also work with them. But that's just a very personal choice that I decided to go for a smaller organization, and that I take more pleasure kind of from being a relatively working on a bigger wheel kind of.
You love the pain. Is it a masochist who likes pain? I can't remember the terminology for it, but I think
but at the same time, the scope of work is higher. Obviously, the perceived responsibility to a certain extent is higher. But I think in the end, it also boils down to how you look at your job. And I think also before being in a startup, I also felt a sense of responsibility. So I always wanted to do good work. And I think in the end, yes, of course, the pressure is a bit different when you know that you have responsibility for a couple of people. But I think the bar that I set for myself, this hasn't changed too much. I think that doesn't really depend on whether you work in a large corporate, in consulting, or in a startup. And I think that we actually have a choice to a certain extent, at least, how much pressure we perceive, and we have to influence it ourselves.
I'm with you, man. So we've skirted around Entrix a little bit so far. So maybe just for the listeners now, Steffen, do you want to give maybe an overview of what it is you guys are trying to solve? Yeah. But then also, if you could lay out, because just bear in mind as well, not everyone is going to be renewable experts or storage experts that are listening to this podcast. So maybe if you could lay out the challenge in the most kind of simplistic way, or the problems that you're approaching, and then also just give an overview of where Entrix kind of fits in that. Like, how are you actually solving those problems, and what's your approach?
Sure. So, taking a bit of a step back on where we currently stand in the energy transition, or in the energy world, kind of what we used to have over the past decades, it's more than a century by now, is that we had a very centralized energy system where we had decentral demand, like all of us having, sitting at home and somehow needing energy being power and heat and so on and so forth. And then at the same time, very central generation. Yeah, so we had those very large power plants, nuclear plants, coal plants, gas plants, and so on and so forth. So we would have a centralized system that would only work in one direction. Yeah, we have the generation, then just flows to all the different nodes of demand. And this is changing a lot now because we want to move more and more towards renewables, because otherwise we're screwing our planet. So we're replacing all the central fossil-based generation with renewables. And the one change of that is that everything is becoming more decentral in terms of generation. That is especially a challenge for the grid operators. But the other thing that is happening with this is, as we're moving to renewables, we are also suddenly losing the kind of control switch for generation. Because before that, when you have a coal or gas power plant, you can, to a certain extent, influence how much electricity you're producing at which point of time. Now, with a solar plant and a wind park and so on and so forth, how do we do that? It's basically the nature that is telling those sites when to produce electricity. But if there's one thing important in the electricity system, it is that it's always balanced. We must not have deviations in that system, because otherwise we're going to have blackouts. Yeah? So we have an alternating current in the system at a frequency of 50 hertz in many countries, and we must not deviate from this. Otherwise, the hardware is just going to break. And now the question is, how do we go about this? Because at nighttime, we still want our fridge to function. We still want to be able to switch our lights on, but there's no sun, so there will not be any solar production. And what we are doing today, as we speak, is that we still have a base load or a basis of conventional generation up and running that can serve that demand. But as we are phasing this out, which we have to, we will have more and more periods of time where demand and supply are not in sync. Yeah? So where we are generating not at the level at which we are consuming, in terms of too little production, but sometimes also overproduction. Yeah? So it might be that in some summer days, for example, that are not too hot but extremely sunny, we just produce more electricity than we need. And right now, because we also can't overburden the grid with too much electricity, right now we would have to literally throw this away, which makes no sense, right? Because it is there, so let's capture it. So that being said, that is kind of the scene. Yeah. So demand and supply don't necessarily match, and there are gaps between that. And ideally, we manage to fill those gaps in order to build an efficient system. And that's where storage comes in. Yeah? Because with storage, what you can do is that you fill up the storage at times of overproduction, that you then basically feed back into the system in times of underproduction. Yeah? That's what storage does in general. And we as Entrix, we are working with batteries. Batteries meaning shipping containers of batteries. Yeah? So those are very large sites. It's de facto still the same technology as we're having in our phones and computers. It's still lithium-ion based batteries, but much bigger. And someone needs to tell those batteries what to do at which point of time. Yeah? And today it's November 1st, 12:30. So the question is, do we charge, do we discharge, or do we want to provide some other services to the electricity system that would basically help to cope with very short-term fluctuations in the system? And that is not something that happens automatically or that nature determines, but there needs to be someone who tells the battery what to do. And that's what we do with Entrix. So basically we take a forward-looking perspective, some 24 to 48 hours into the future, and then say, cool, based on what we think will be the demand for the flexibility that we have in the batteries, we think right now, November 1st at 12:30, we should be discharging the battery for whatever reason.
Gotcha. Right. So today's current solution that's out there in the market today, is that kind of like a manual thing where there'll be individuals actually controlling those things from a human standpoint, or like what is there today?
Yeah, it makes total sense. Sorry, I should have learned this a bit better, how to exactly pitch it. Today the problem is it's not really in the system in the first place. So we don't really have storage just yet. Yeah, so storage at a large scale, especially that you can use for everyday balancing, that is just not something that we really have in the energy system just yet. Yeah, so I think what we've heard in the press a lot over the past couple of weeks and months was gas storage, but that's kind of seasonal storage, where we basically fill this up over the course of summer and then reduce the capacity again over winter. That is seasonal storage, but that's not what we do. What we do is really charging right now and discharging again in half an hour. And this is just not something we have in the system yet, because in the past, those technologies with which you could do that were too expensive. So batteries were just too expensive to actually use them for this. Plus, there was also not really the necessity of doing that because the share of renewables, relatively speaking, in the energy system was so low that with conventional generation, you could still buffer everything perfectly fine. Yeah? And that is the part that's changing now. So it's a nascent application kind of.
Gotcha. Right. So where does Entrix fit in all this? Because I understand what you're saying about the problem and what you're trying to enable, but how do you guys fit into that pipeline? Like, where do you step in and what do you impact on that pipeline?
So what we do is the software that tells the batteries when to charge and when to discharge. And software does not mean the operating system of the battery, but you can look at us as kind of the interface between the hardware and energy markets. So we are, for example, as Entrix, we have our own balancing agreements, that's called. So we basically have a power account, if you want to put it like this, with the large grid operators. Plus we are a member of the European Power Exchange, so we can trade electricity ourselves on power markets. We are certified to do that. And then at the same time, we connect to the batteries, so we can send them a signal that says, now discharge, please. That is where we feed in. We don't own the batteries ourselves, so we control them for their owners, and the owners are typically family offices, large infrastructure funds, smaller utilities. Also, the bigger utilities have them, but typically they have their own trading desk. But we hope, for example, to work closely with municipal works. So basically, local utilities that are owned by municipalities and so on. They would have those assets because they know that this infrastructure is needed in the system, but they don't necessarily have the skill and the competence to actually deploy it in the best possible way on energy markets.
So obviously this is the AI Game Changers podcast, so it would be a shame if we didn't speak about data science and ML at some stage. So where does that, I mean, I've got some pretty good ideas about where that fits in, but just from your perspective, where does the data science and machine learning part help you guys achieve what you're trying to achieve? Where does that have impact?
I have to be careful that I don't go into too much detail with you because, as I said, I'm a business guy, and I didn't even manage to do computer science as my minor in my masters. So I'm still not sure if I get the lingo exactly right. But eventually, what we need tech for and what we need data science for is to really understand the daily deviations that we would see, because literally every single day is different. And November 1st is different than November 2nd, and so on and so forth. And that's what data science helps us to understand. We have to make sense of quite some data, and you can start in the beginning with looking at prices, because in prices there's lots of information is already factored in, kind of, so you can actually work quite a bit already with the price signals that you would be getting. But at some point, ideally, we managed to make this, or one would manage to make this more advanced and to also understand the fundamentals of the energy system a bit better, because it's just such a multifaceted system, and you have to identify what kind of are the most relevant drivers that I want to keep an eye on, because it will somehow influence the need for flexibility, and that's what batteries in the end do. When I use the term flexibility, I mean you can either charge or discharge, because you can use it both ways. And it's just crazy how complex that system is, right? I think last week we had this partial solar eclipse, and then 2-3 weeks before that, we would get a message from the grid operator reminding all the participants in the energy market that there's the solar eclipse coming, and that therefore the production of solar will be lower on this day than on an average day. So people keep it in their mind. And, that is like a bit of a one-off thing, but this shows how complex that system is and on which level of detail you actually have to be aware of how that system works. And therefore, there's just loads and loads of data that we have to try to make sense of in the best possible way. And that's the energy markets perspective. And the other part that's also quite interesting is to understand the hardware behind it. Because batteries, they're actually very tricky pieces to work with. And ideally we use them smarter than at least I use my iPhone. My iPhone, I charge up to 100%, and then I drive it down to 5%, and then I hook it up on a power cable that's not made for it. So I'm trying to charge it a bit faster, and that's actually ruining the battery. I shouldn't do that. And if I do that with my iPhone, it's just annoying because I just keep charging more frequently, but that's okay. But when you do that with very large batteries, you just lose a lot of money with that, because the capacity that you would have left in those batteries reduces, and that's a substantial investment that you make into these assets. So there's actually a very strong tech component also involved in understanding how do the physics and how does the chemistry work in the battery with regards to the degradation. So how can we make sure that we use the capacity that we have in there in the best possible fashion, and that we have kind of well-defined opportunity cost, more or less, in our optimization, versus the value that we can capture on energy markets.
Wow, man! Do you know, it's really cool to hear. So one of the reasons why I love doing this podcast is because, number one, obviously, I love artificial intelligence and data science and all the buzzwords, but hearing new exciting use cases that aren't your typical, we do marketing analytics to boost sales profitability. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's really cool, and I've said this multiple times on the podcast as well. People listening that are working on that, I'm very sorry, and it's super important. But when you hear about real impactful companies doing things that are super innovative, that are going to have a dramatic impact on our everyday life for the next, however long. It's incredible to hear what data science and ML can actually impact, and what tech, generally speaking, can do for humanity, right?
No, and that's kind of the aspiration, and what I'm still struggling with kind of is to understand where exactly we need which tool and which piece of technology kind of. I think that was the biggest learning for me in the beginning, because obviously all the people who are listening to this who actually know what machine learning is, they will probably hate me for this. But in the beginning I was like, okay, with machine learning you can solve everything. So let's just say that we do crazy ML and let's put blockchain and quantum computing on it as well, and then everything will be solved automatically, kind of. Yeah,
and then it's instant IPO.
Exactly.
Instant
exactly.
IPO.
And then everything is taken care of. And the blockchain and quantum computing, actually, this turned out to become a joke in the team, because I actually several times said, but this must be, if we do this with machine learning, this should work. And then Steffen, slowly. First we do ordinary statistics, and then we can do the more advanced stuff. And I said, well, I also could say blockchain and quantum computing. I said, okay, at some point.
Can you do crypto with batteries? If you get all four, that's where you'll really hit a strong IPO. If you get crypto in there as well.
No, but I think that's also an interesting part. That was quite interesting for me to understand a bit better that, all these technology concepts, they are so broad, and I think choosing the right one for the right problem, that is actually the part that is very interesting. And I think that is also the part where you have to be very careful when you start a business, that you don't become I think my takeaway from that was, to a certain extent, don't try to go too crazy in terms of tools and methods that you want to use, just for the sake of being able to say that you're using them. But I think there's so much value in understanding the problem at hand properly in the first place, and sometimes also doing, from a technology perspective, rather simple things, but that help you to understand how the thing's working. I think that was a great learning for me, that there's not just this one toolbox that you just open and then everything just automatically works. It takes quite some effort to build something from scratch. And if you want to build something from scratch, and the more complex I think the system is, the more that matters. Don't just go for crazy AI, quantum computing, blockchain application, whatever, but spare the buzzwords and actually try to understand the fundamentals and the key mechanisms of how things belong together, and then make it more advanced from there. I think that was an interesting learning for me, kind of.
Yeah, we've. I feel like we've jumped forward a little bit, but it would be good. sorry to kind of reverse a little bit, but no, it's all good. But I think it would be good to kind of understand, because you've been in business for 15 months now, or something roughly. Like that. So, roughly speaking, I mean, the first year in any startup is always going to be probably the most fun, I guess, but then also probably the most challenging. And there's probably a lot of hard lessons along the way that come with just doing the thing, right? So maybe, can you take us back to day one? How did that feel, and what did that look like? I know it sounds a bit weird, but can you just give us a kind of visual representation of that? or an emotional one?
Yeah, I'm just trying to think of exactly how how to describe that emotion. I think it was a mix of excitement in the sense of I was very much looking forward to working on this, but at the same time a certain, I'm not sure if that's the right term. You can correct my vocabulary, but to a certain extent a certain void or maybe lack of direction in a sense that you didn't really know where to start, right? Because I think, and especially in our case, I think it's actually interesting because the problem that we wanted to solve, that was fairly well defined. So it was clear that we wanted to that we wanted to be that interface for batteries to energy markets. So I think that is already fairly specific, and we didn't pivot that idea. I think this one, we very much stuck to this. But still, there are just so many things that you can stuck with, and understanding what matters and how to prioritize, and what are all the hidden things that you have to take care of. I think that was probably the part that was most complicated to a certain extent in the beginning, just to get a grasp of this and to learn the lingo, not only on tech topics, but try navigating the energy industry. There are just so many different terms and words used for concepts that are not most intuitive or not that intuitive. So I think in the beginning it was a bit of getting your head straight and saying, okay, whatever, let's just start and then we'll figure it out along the way. I think that's a bit how it felt.
Well, because that's probably the romantic part of entrepreneurship, right? When you're sat in a pub, with your founders or whoever, and you're talking about changing the world and solving these huge problems, but then the realization hits that, okay, cool, we've actually got to fucking do this now. And day one is about, I would imagine it's about segmenting those problems in terms of manageable bite-sized things that you would approach, right? But yeah, I think that's. Do you feel like, looking back before you started the business, do you feel like you had maybe any sense of like ignorance or rose-tinted glasses? I hope that terminology transfers over to Germany, but before you got into the actual role itself.
Actually perfectly translates into German. We say rosa-rote Brille.
Really?
It's exactly the same. Probably. But honestly, I think it could have been worse, kind of, on two dimensions. So I think other people wear those glasses maybe a bit more. Plus, I think what was very, very helpful for me was not to become a founder straight after finishing university, but actually working in an organization for a couple of years in between. I think that was very good for me to understand what I want, to a certain extent who I am. I'm still trying to figure this one out, but at least I made a bit of progress on this one. And I think I also learned a bit what are my strengths, what are my weaknesses. I think I learned lots of tools and skills. I'm not sure, I think we kind of skipped that topic, but I was a consultant. So for the people who don't know that, I was a consultant. So, I think really this learning this skill to a certain extent of how to look at a problem and how to take it into different bits and pieces that are somehow digestible, and then trying to tackle them one after another. I think that was very important. And I think I was aware of the kind of complexity that would come with that. At least I had a sense of it. Not that I could really pinpoint it where exactly it would show. But I think I had some proper respect of the task ahead of me, and I didn't have this perspective of now I just do this and then I just collect a bit of funding and then easy going, and in 5 years from now this is a unicorn, and then I'm lying on the Bahamas. That was not the attitude.
Yeah. Because you're obviously a first-time founder, right? So I think that there are going to be some challenges that you're going to face in this role for the first time, both from an operational solving the problem perspective, but then also from a market condition perspective, and then also from an investor and a team perspective, right? So what were the realizations that you had stepping into a role as an MD and a founder that you weren't aware of before you did that role?
Yeah. So I think one topic we already touched upon, that's just the scope of topics that I had to work on. I think that is the part that, of course, you know it abstractly, but then when you see it, it's crazy. And there were days where I had to kind of sell the strategy of what we're doing. And in the next step, I had to go into the machine room of exactly understanding what kind of data we'd be using for certain analysis and going into the very small details of energy markets regulation. And, for example, I managed most of our registration with the European Power Exchange, and for our balancing agreements with the grid operators. And there you are just very deep in the forest. So those things, they're very, very detailed. And I think balancing that kind of breadth of topics, I think that is the part that I was struggling with a bit. Then I think in terms of role in the team, I would like to think of myself as someone who is very collaborative, and I try to bring people together. And I think the problem for me is I typically have an idea of where I want to go, and I typically have, as I said, I typically have an opinion. But I think I had to learn leadership in a sense. So to understand how exactly to make sure that, how to involve different kinds of opinions, and not for the sake of not wanting to involve them, but doing this the right way. So all opinions are heard, they're appreciated, but then we would also have to move on at some point. And I'm actually younger than some members in my team, and to me that felt a bit weird to then eventually be the one who is accountable and who also gets to call the shots. Sometimes that's a cool thing, sometimes that's a painful thing, and my responsibility. And I think there's no worse thing than not calling a shot when it needs to be called. But I think this is something that I had to learn personally, that I wasn't afraid of doing this, and that I wasn't afraid of stepping on someone's toes, but that it would be my responsibility to say, okay, understood, we don't exactly know where to go, but this is where we will go because we can't stand still. I think that was a difficult one. And then, in the first couple of months, I think what's crazy is how fast the organization evolves. And I actually have to think often back to my consulting times, because the problems that you have with 10 people are exactly the same as you have with 70,000 people. In the end, it's about what exactly is our mindset, how exactly do we approach culture, how much ownership do we feel, how much knowledge do we share with each other, and so on. And the cool thing about Entrix is that we really want to collaborate and that we really want to move in the same direction, and we have no politics. But still, setting this organization up for success in terms of our way of collaboration is effective. I think this is very tricky, and I always thought of me as someone who really cares about this and who's aware of doing that. And I think I've said this to so many people that for me, culture is not something that happens randomly, but you actually have to work hard on this. But it's so difficult. And not because we don't have the right people or there's opposition, but it's just so fuzzy, and trying to put those things in the right order, that's just a tricky part. So I think that was also something that I'm still struggling with, kind of, is to get this part right. And you have to constantly kind of revisit the approaches that you've established. In the beginning, we had, just to make that specific, what I mean with that, in the beginning we had to stand up with the 3 people that we started with on an everyday basis. And of course, everyone knew what we would be doing. And at some point, we tried to do that daily stand up with 8 people, and we still tried to limit it to those 15 minutes. And then there were basically 2 options. Either we didn't stick to the 15 minutes, or if we stuck to the 15 minutes, the update was so high level that it was just a waste of time for everyone. So you had to say, after, I don't know when that was, 3 months or so, no, our stand-up approach, that doesn't work anymore because it's just ineffective. We don't learn from this anymore. Then we changed it a bit, but then 3 months later, the organization was a bit bigger again. The teams were more fleshed out. We had to adapt that approach again. And, this is this constant thing that something is never really static, and that you constantly have to ask yourself, how do we have to tailor this to a current situation that we're in?
Because you guys have grown from what? So you started with 3.
We started with
correct?
3, and now we are. Depends on how you count, but 20, give or take.
Cool. Okay, so that's huge growth, really, for the first year in business. I know it's not, astronomical. We've hired 5,000 people, but going from 2-3 people in a room to then having 10 times that amount, 10 times the amount of characters and personalities and levels of seniority and areas that they, their expertise in. That is a huge jump, especially to do that within the first year, right? So there must have been, I'm trying to emotionally connect and think how that must have felt for you doing that, because, coming from your background as well, you've done such a huge jump in terms of, again, your responsibilities and your ownership over everything. There must have been moments of doubt along the way, right? Because, I mean, unless you're a robot, you must have some kind of emotional narrative internally, right? So maybe talk to us about the moments throughout the last 15 months where you felt not out of your depth, because I don't think you would have felt like that, but maybe that you needed to step up in terms of either leadership, mindset, or something else.
Yeah, I think so. That constantly happens, right? And I think that the question that kind of that is kind of the common denominator, or the overarching question kind of about this is, am I good enough for this? That's a very personal part, and there's much more than just me. But if we make it about me, I think that's the key question that I'm asking myself, in a sense of, am I good enough for the stuff that I'm doing there? And just to give you a few examples, I think the one part is probably the first time that happened was, I think in the beginning I was kind of comfortable being in that size of a team. I think that was still manageable, but there we, for example, had those discussions about what kind of technology do we use, how exactly do I start filling my role as the leader and not as just a team member, kind of. I think that was a big difference to what I did before. So I think that was the first time that I struggled a bit. And then there were also those moments where I also felt, in a sense, that I failed in the in putting my weight kind of for the organization, because even when you're 20 people or so, there's still quite some stuff that I just have on my very personal to-do list, where, for example, for the power exchange registration, where it would just be my to-do to actually get this done and to get it out and to make sure that this works. And this is mission critical. If you're not registered with the European Power Exchange, there's just no way of trading power, full stop. And there were obviously moments where we overlooked aspects, and that therefore some pieces were delayed, and I'm also prone, unfortunately, to over-promising. Yeah, so what the team typically hears is, okay, I'll look at it tonight, but I don't manage to, because sometimes I can't, sometimes I don't want to. And I think that's the part that I keep struggling the most with, that I actually have to let go of certain topics, and that I really have to fight this over optimism and be realistic, and then at the same time also still make sure that I pull my weight. I think that's probably the part that is most challenging on a continuous basis, kind of, if that makes sense.
You I think you said something really poignant in that, which is the question, like, am I good enough?
Yeah.
I think anyone who's serious about having impact on their career in general would probably ask that to themselves on a daily basis, right? I mean, I know I do all the time, and I've worked in my role for probably like 12 years, right? And there are still some days where I wake up and think, shit, is this all just luck?
Yeah.
And I've just happened to jump on some kind of wave that has led me to today, but actually my impact has been really small. So, like, the reason why I want to ask you this is because there'll be other people that are listening to this podcast who are probably thinking about founding some sort of organization, but maybe hold themselves back because of those internal narratives and because of those internal doubts. So how do you manage that am I good enough conversation in your head? Like, what are it's really difficult to say what the practical things you do because it's such an emotional thing, right? But like, how do you combat that internal mindset or that internal conversation?
I think, I don't know, I'm not a psychologist, and I'm not sure. Neither am I, by the way. I'm not sure if I've reflected about this enough. But I think what helps me is actually talking about it, and having a couple of people, my wife, my family, my friends, some colleagues. Actually, I think most of the colleagues. I think I try to be very open and try not to keep up a masquerade, kind of. I think that helps. Because they can help you as well, right? So what we, for example, did, or what I, for example, did a couple of weeks ago is that I told the team, guys, I'm not happy with the way that my to-dos that I have on my list are progressing, and I feel uncomfortable about it. but I think everyone was kind of understanding in a sense that they didn't know that I didn't work hard enough or so. They said, well, Steffen, you're also trying to manage too many things at the same time, and you also have to let go. You have to trust us. So, just give us the work, and then it will be okay. And I think, so talking about it helps a lot, and to see actually that you're not in this alone, but that there's a team behind it who helps, and they are very, very committed. This is the most exciting part about it, that there are people who are in this as well, and they are so incredibly talented, and they're pulling so much weight. I think that's probably the key thing. So make them your ally, and not try to keep it away from them. Of course, you have to be a bit careful, but I think so far we were lucky that we can talk about maybe the downturn that the startup scene experienced in the past half year or so. I think we were very much unaffected by this. So this, of course, makes life much, much easier compared to what I've heard from friends and acquaintances of what they had to deal with. But I think that's one part. And the other part I just forgot. I had a different thought in my mind, but it slipped my mind. Yeah, I know. I remember. And I think what also helps me is to think, even if this fails, I have a proper education, I worked in proper jobs and so on. So if I'm not made for this, I can step down, and I can do something different, and I will not starve. And of course, that's not my aspiration. Of course, I will not do that. But I think what's important for me, at least, is that I have to a certain extent this peace of mind that even if something weren't to work out, it wouldn't be the end of our lives. And I actually think that this is important, to set a certain boundary. And in the end, I personally invest so much of my time in this and so much of my passion and energy. But in the end, this is really not all. In the end, it is about, the people that I live with, kind of, and that should always take priority. And that, for example, also helps me to set boundaries on a weekend. Typically on a weekend, I try to keep work to an absolute minimum. And there have been many weekends where I didn't work at all. And this is good. I need this. I can make myself entirely crazy about there's more stuff to do, but there will always be more stuff to do. But sometimes things just have to wait, and I have to make sure that I personally find the right balance for me, just as everyone on the team also has to find the right balance for them.
Yeah, you've mentioned your team quite a lot, and looking from the outside in, so I know some of the people that you've hired, I know of them, and for the stage that you guys are at as a business, you've hired some phenomenal people, so really well done on that. But then secondly, I just wanted to ask you, what do you think your team would say about you if you weren't in the room?
It's a good one. I would hope that they would say that. So first of all, they would say that I'm never punctual to a meeting.
That's why you're not in the room, man. You're just late.
Exactly. Probably that happens often because they always complain about me not being there on time. No, I think on the positive side, what they would say about me, I think, is that I think I'm doing okay in a sense of having a fairly comprehensive understanding of what are the different bits and pieces that we're currently working on and how they belong together. And I think I think they appreciate. That sounds so weird, but I think they also appreciate that I sometimes manage to say, hey, let's zoom 2 levels up and try to get the right perspective, and then let's move in a coordinated fashion in one direction. I think this is what they probably like about me. I think what they're sometimes struggling with is a bit of chaos that I create, because sometimes I might just say, well, but yes, maybe I said this.
Blockchain.
Maybe I said this. Yeah, the blockchain thing. That's a bit of a joke. But I think what's difficult is that I think a lot about things in a sense of, because of the role that I have, I just see very many different bits and pieces, and I think because of that, some reflections just happen in my head, kind of. And then for me, it's fairly clear of what we have to do now. And I think if everyone in the team had the same information and would have seen the same things, they probably would have come to the same conclusion. But I think sometimes there's a bit of a mismatch of me saying, yeah, but it's absolutely clear that we have to do this now. And they're like, hang on, how? Why? Last week we discussed something different. Why does it have to be like this right now? So I think that is something that I could probably, or that I should become much better in, that I really make sure that everyone has a comprehensive understanding of what's happening. And that doesn't mean that everyone has to understand everything in the last detail. But I think everyone should kind of understand the overall puzzle that we're working on. And at least it should be like a blurry picture that everyone has in their head, but they know that the top left corner is dark blue. Yeah, everyone should know that. And then if they work on the bottom right corner, that's okay. And the bottom right corner, they can also know the different shades of red that they're working with. But they need to know that the top left corner is dark blue. And I think sometimes I'm failing a bit on making sure that this is actually there. And then I'm just very bad in letting go. I always think that I have an opinion and that I can add some value to something, but more often than not, I should just trust the team because they're amazing, and they should do it, and we should get it out because speed matters. And I should debottleneck myself.
Yeah, do you know what, dude? I don't know many founders that have cracked that point, to be honest, generally speaking. No. I mean, I only work with founders, and I'm pretty sure every single person I work with has got some kind of battle that they face in terms of letting go.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, I mean, that's probably what's made you successful today, right? So that element of ownership.
Yeah, it's. I think it has different levels, and I think that's one of the key things that you want to master, because it's not necessarily, it always sounds like a mistrust towards the team. That's not what this is necessarily about. But I think for me, this also quite a bit comes from, hey, I've seen process XYZ before, so therefore it makes sense that I'm the subject matter expert on this, therefore I should contribute. I think that's one part. And the other part is also this feeling of, what do I actually do in the organization if I don't have to do this anymore myself, in the sense of, so if I don't participate in sending out an offer and create some PowerPoint pages for that offer myself, then it feels like I'm not putting my weight. So I think that's also a struggle. That's also one of the factors that adds to that struggle. But it's super, super important to let go of this quickly, because otherwise you will just never become effective as an organization.
Well, good, man. I guess the last couple of questions I've got for you really is probably just one question really. You can kind of wrap these up in two things, because I did want to get your thoughts on the future of renewable energy generally speaking. What do you think is going to happen over the next kind of 10? It's such a difficult timeline to work on with renewable energy though, right? Because what is it, 50 years? And wait, no, how long have we got? So 2050, we're going to be net zero, right? So apparently. So what, 27 years till we get there? That's a long time period to be predicting anything, generally. But what's a good time period? Would you feel confident in your prediction?
I think this topic is so multifaceted. I think one could actually come from the end, and I think that's the part that I get quite passionate and a bit emotional about this, because I think it is in the end absolutely freaking clear where we have to go. We have to build a system that is running on renewables, where we use the technology and the tools that we have in the best possible way. But we also have to get moving. And, you're saying, and because time is literally running out, and I'm not one of those activists, I wouldn't stick myself to, I wouldn't glue myself to tarmac or so. But, we have to get moving, because if we look at this, if you look at the energy transition in a global scale, you just mentioned the time horizon of some 27 years left until 2050. Well, let's also look back. We started the energy transition some 20 years ago. We had Fukushima 11 years ago. That's when it really started picking up speed in Germany. And in the end, we are still at a state where we are so far away from being done. We have a bit more than 12%, I think we have done roughly an eighth of the installed electricity generation from renewables than we need to reach of the amount that we need to reach net zero. That means there are still 87% to go. Yeah, and making 87% go in or work in 27 years, whilst we have only done 10% in the past 20 years, this is difficult. And at the same time, it's taking us so long on so many things, and we are so filled up to a certain extent as a society, especially in Germany, where we say, hey, let's just afford having a discussion about nuclear power for half a year. Why? Let's say yes or no. And I have an opinion, but let's just decide and let's work with it and let's deal with it, because otherwise it will not work. The same with grid build outs and so on and so forth. So I'm in principle super, super optimistic that we can do it, because the technologies they are there. And I think we actually have an idea of how this could look like, but we have to be very, very, very careful of not, in German you would say, in Schönheit sterben, dying in beauty, that we try to get everything perfectly right, because that's a bit to a certain extent as it is with a startup. Nothing is worse than standing still. Let's get moving, because otherwise it will not work. So that's the kind of part that I'm a bit concerned about when it comes to this, that it's just taking us way too long to get moving.
Well, look, I want to end on something optimistic, dude, and positive. So what's your there is one more question actually. So what are you most optimistic about over the next kind of 10 to 20 years?
As said, I think we actually know how to do it. And I think what I very much like, and we didn't really talk about this, about the startup investor scene and so on. But if there's the past 6-7 months, they have actually been miserable for economy and especially for startups. But I think in the end, if there's one industry that you currently want to be in, it's the energy industry. And I think it's so cool to see how many brilliant minds are starting to become part of that industry and how much societies are becoming aware of that topic. So I think with a joint effort, we can do it. I didn't want to be perceived too negatively before. I'm just saying it is there, and of course it's a challenge, but we know how to do it. So let's go. And I think that's also the part that I'm optimistic about for the next 10 to 20 years, because I think societies have been successful in then at some point, once they have dwelled on topics for long enough, to then say, okay, now we figured it out and now off we go. And I think that will be to a certain extent also hopefully how the energy transition will look like. And there's right now so much capital flowing in this and so on. I still think I'm still optimistic that we can manage, but we must be a bit pragmatic doing so as well.
Well, dude, today, honestly, thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure to spend just over an hour with you now. But yeah, I guess from my side and I guess everyone else's sake on the planet, I wish you the best of luck, and I hope you guys nail it.
Thank you, Luke. I also very much enjoyed it, and it's great being part of this, and also seeing so many tech people becoming part of that energy transition, because we need them. The system has to become more intelligent, so the people who are listening to this, hopefully, they are the ones who can drive it forward.